Hello, welcome. My name is Jenny Morris and I'm the Chair of the Board of Westgate Health Cooperative, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Community Mental Health Forum on mental health and wellbeing in a global pandemic. Originally, it would have been Liz Hunter who'd be welcoming you, our CEO, but as per our request, although negative on a RAT test, she isn't feeling well, so she'll be joining us online. I'd like to open this forum by acknowledging the traditional owners of the many lands upon which we meet today, who sustained healthy communities and wisely managed these lands for thousands of years. We pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging, as we at Westgate Health remain committed to shape a future in which all thrive. I would also like to extend a warm welcome to any First Nations people who are joining our forum this evening. You might ask, how did these forums come about? Westgate Health has a long, proud history as a not-for-profit, member-owned cooperative that provides excellent, affordable health service to its members. Located in South Kingsville and Newport, we've been here for around 40 years. We provide GP and allied health services in a caring, compassionate, patient-centred setting, and we typically retain our high-performing staff and patients for many years. As a not-for-profit, our profits go back into the caring for our community. We offer services across 2 sites in South Kingsville and Newport, and our GPs meet up each month. They all practice medicine in their own unique way, and they deeply care about the patients they see. Like many of you, they know where the cracks are in the system and experience them firsthand. As we are a not-for-profit cooperative, we are also a voice and a community leader when it comes to primary health. Last year, we received a generous grant from Westgate Neighbourhood Fund to run this series of community mental health forums. We went to our GPs and asked, what issues are your patients facing? The number one mental health issue they identified was the impact of the pandemic, and it's how this forum came about. Westgate Health Cooperative is always searching for clinicians who want to provide services in a flexible and supportive work environment and who can enhance the health and wellbeing of our patients and our community. If you or anyone you know are curious about what it is like to be a clinician at Westgate Health, please call our clinic and speak with Liz or send an email to info@Westgate Health. It is our great privilege to now launch the first of the public community health forums in this series. We are delighted to have Dr. Ben Shear as our facilitator and have a great lineup of presenters and topics. We are incredibly grateful to Westgate Neighbourhood Fund for their generous donation, which made it all possible. And we'd like to thank Minister Melissa Horne for her ongoing interest and support for our cooperative and for this program. This forum is for you, our attendees, so we really encourage you to ask your questions today, either in person or via the Q&A function on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will ask them also during the panel discussion. If you are watching online and have any technical difficulties, please refresh your page and you can chat to our events team via the tech support button on the bottom right hand of your screen. Thank you so much for attending. I hope you feel very welcome, both in person and online, and that you'll take away information and inspiration that will enhance your clinical practice. Just some housekeepings. Our emergency exits are where you came in and out the back, straight out the back, and our toilets are turn left and left again. So we'd like to just show you the launch with Minister Melissa Horne. Thank you.
Westgate Health Cooperative is a not-for-profit community health organisation that's been around for around 40 years. The project that we're about to launch into is a community mental health project. And we see this as an opportunity to meet the needs of many people in the community by empowering them to find their own way through the mental health system.
Mental health has always been a common theme for GPs in terms of people who they're dealing with. During the pandemic, all the mental health problems that people have had have got greater and more intense, and what can we do to help people to find their way through this, to be able to access resources that are there, and to do this in a community collaborative way of itself is bringing people together. And some of that networking, some of that people working together, problem solving together, is of itself going to be helping people find their way through this.
We're a really diverse community, and it's an opportunity for people to have their needs met where they're at, and that's what we see as being hugely beneficial, because that's it's not one size fits all, and that's a challenge for our GPs as they work their way or guide people through the system as to what's best going to meet their needs.
So we couldn't have done this without the funding, and we're just so thrilled that we actually have now being able to get funding that we can put this program on, run face-to-face sessions for the community. It's a game changer for us. We just simply would not be here having this conversation if it had not been for the grant that we received from Westgate Neighbourhood Fund.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome to what I hope will be a very important gathering for everyone's health and well-being. I think it's a time to reflect on what has happened and plan for how to look after ourselves and our loved ones in this new world that we find ourselves in. In acknowledging that it is a new world, I'd like to welcome both all of our attendees that are in person, but also those that are with us online. We felt that it was really important to have a hybrid model in terms of offering both in-person attendance and online attendance, given that that's now something that we really is a necessity. And I was actually talking to my wife this morning about the in-person attendance and the online attendance and the numbers of each. And yeah, my wife was sort of like, yeah, if I see a readings event and it's online, yeah, I'll go to that. But if it's in person, I can't really be bothered. So my patience as well. So I'm going back to face-to-face sessions from next week. And it's about 50% are going to come back in and 50% are going to elect to stay with the Zoom sessions or the or telephone. Or the other important thing is that it can be mandated, obviously, for people to attend online if they have any symptoms of COVID or are required to isolate. I think it's a good time to acknowledge that hopefully we're transitioning out of the crisis phase of this pandemic. And with any crisis, I think all of us must have experienced one or all of the acute human stress responses, which is fight, flight, freeze or faint. I know I've personally experienced them all and assisted my own family and patients with dealing with that. And I think it's important to acknowledge that we've all experienced an unprecedented collective trauma in the pandemic, and that myself and the excellent speakers that we've got tonight don't have all the answers for this. It's sort of uncharted territory. When I was working in hospitals, if there had been a critical incident, for example, a staff member getting assaulted, we would be offered debriefing sessions with an expert that facilitated these debriefing sessions. The expert didn't come in and say, this is how you should be feeling, this is the way to deal with it. They just listened and offered their advice where they could, and that's what I hope this forum tonight will be about, that we've all been through this together and we all need to talk about it together, and hopefully we can be some assistance in facilitating that discussion. I think it's quite tempting to soldier on without debriefing these things, get on with it, sort of pretend it didn't happen. But I think there's some risks with that. And I think those acute stress symptoms can become chronic stress symptoms if you don't think about it and talk about it. Those sort of chronic stress symptoms can be in people's minds with things like anxiety, insomnia, depression, irritability or anger, or grief. I think can also equally be expressed in the body, so things like fatigue or chronic pain, migraines or gastrointestinal upset. Last week we got a call from my child's school that he was in the sick bay with a sore tummy. Went and picked him up, and after about an hour of a bit of TLC from mum and dad, he was feeling good again. But I actually reflected about this, and we sort of did some digging about what had happened that day, and it turned out that his teacher was away that day. It might not seem like a big thing, but because there's no CRTs, casual relief teachers available at the moment, all the kids sort of got split off into other classrooms, so they didn't know some of the kids or the teachers there. And I think that the tummy ache that my son had was him remembering that rupture. So I use the word rupture as something that suddenly bursts, and it usually disrupts a certain harmony that someone has. And I think some examples from the pandemic that people might have experienced of ruptures could range from anything as simple as, you usually go and get your coffee in the morning, and you share a smile with the barista. Now the barista's got a mask on, you can't really share that experience. Then it can move on to things like children being separated from their grandparents during the very strict lockdowns, and obviously not being able to attend school and doing remote learning. I think people living alone must have done it really tough during the pandemic, being so isolated. So that's a huge rupture for someone. Suddenly they're not allowed to, they don't have any human connection. And especially the elderly in nursing homes who not only had to deal with being cut off from their family, but also this fear that if they did contract the virus, that there could be serious risk to their health. So I think that getting back to my son's situation where he had this rupture where his teacher was away, it might seem small on the surface, but I think it brought up everything, all of those ruptures that he experienced during the pandemic. So moving on now to introduce our first speaker, who is an expert in trauma, rupture, healing, and how to safely explore beneath the surface, because I think obviously on the surface it just seemed like, his teacher's away, just go to another class and get on with it. But I think that requires some consideration, and it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. George Halaz, who's a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at Monash Health. His special areas of interest and publications include ADHD, Holocaust trauma, and intergenerational trauma transmission, trauma-informed care, child and adolescent psychotherapy and ethics, and children of parents with mental illness. Also, poetry is self-expression. Over the last 20 years, he's lectured on trauma-related themes in the UK, Israel, Poland, Hong Kong, US, New Zealand, and Australia. He was also a regular panellist on Melbourne radio station Triple R's Radiotherapy for close to 25 years, where I think he was known as Dr. Malice. Because George can explain it maybe. So we're very lucky to have George speak with us tonight, and I'd like to welcome him up.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for the invitation to share some thoughts and explore this critically urgent, important issue of how to be safe in a pandemic. Now, you mentioned, Ben, about Dr. Malice and how I came to be given that name on Radio Triple R. The first rule is that when we started back in the 1990s, you weren't allowed to use your doctor's genuine name on radio. So we had to have a pseudonym. And the producer then asked me, what would I like to be called? And I had never been asked that question because it was self-evident what my name was, but here was a challenge. So I said, I really don't know, but I could tell you a story that I usually introduce myself to my patients and the children with the parents with the question, do you know who I am? And often they say who I am. Sometimes they say, no, I don't know. One of the most surprising introductions was when the child said, you're one of my relatives. And I said, I beg your pardon, how does that work? Well, my parents told me that we're visiting a relative, so you must be it. So I explained that they've got very clever parents and very sensitive parents who obviously didn't want to upset them by telling them that they're going to see a doctor. So they probably suggested a relative to make them not feel worried, which allowed me to say, I'm actually a worry doctor. To which the child said, oh, what are you worried about? I said, well, yes, I've got my worries, but I'm here to actually listen to your worries. And I said, do you know what a worry doctor might do? He goes, shrink heads, because you're called a shrink. I said, well, that's pretty creative. I actually shrink worries. And the eyes lit up, the eyebrows went up, yeah, like I've got worries. And then we were off, we were engaged. So the name Hallis was pretty hard to pronounce or get the sound. So one child actually said, oh, of course I know who you are, you're Dr. Malice. So I said, well, that's pretty close. The producer said, that's your name. So that's how I got Dr. Malice on Triple R. Now, what I've been asked to speak to is an extraordinarily challenging and confronting topic because, as Ben said, and as we all heard the refrain, we're all in this together, but no one's actually said what we're in. And what we're in and have been and remain is confronting life and death threatening situations, actually anticipating or afterwards grieving. So in one level, this is some of the most serious confrontations that we know in our life cycle. What we didn't get taught is that what went overboard, as it were, was our sense of safety. Safety is something that most of us have been fortunate enough most of the times to take for granted. The pandemic shattered, or as Ben used the words, ruptured that continuity of safety. And so, as Ben also introduced the idea of his child who just had a tummy ache, and it was the TLC in the home setting that actually explored what happened during the day. Oh, nothing, just the teacher didn't turn up and that's it. That is something on the surface, a sentence. Below the surface, there's a whole other world. And so I'm going to use the metaphor of any scuba divers here? I obviously can't ask online, but anyone here? No? Okay, just very briefly, the first rule of scuba diving, beside the obvious is you have to learn to breathe underwater, is that you never ever go scuba diving alone. You always go with a buddy. And the buddy is your partner, and you have to have a buddy because if you go down to the depth and you get into problems down deep, you have to what's called buddy breathe. Use the mouthpiece for yourself. That other person is your buddy breathing with you in sync as you come up. So this is a life-saving maneuver. You do this without a buddy, you're gone. You do this without a buddy, you're gone because you dash up to the surface and you get the bends. very nasty situation. I'm not here to talk about scuba diving, it's a metaphor. Ben's child was actually at the depth of being attached to a teacher, a very significant person in his or her life, and the teacher was the buddy who suddenly goes missing. And what I'm going to present are the consequences of what happens under the surface when apparently everyday events, like a barista wearing a mask and the smile's gone, the child's teacher is not there, or, God forbid, the child's parent suddenly goes missing. Not physically only, but mentally. The child's parent develops a mental illness during COVID. The elephant in the room. Now, the first image there is something familiar to all of us who've done any sort of plane travel. First rule, going from the metaphor going down below the surface is above the surface. Breathing is just as important above there as it is below and on the surface. First rule on the aeroplane you get taught, if there's an emergency, a mask drops down, you do not give it to the person next to you, even if it's your child. You breathe for yourself first. This is a reminder that it is not selfish, it's life-saving. So I'm going to disrupt the conversation because the introduction mentioned about attending to the needs of our patients. I'm going to disrupt that and say, first, we attend to our needs. I'm not apologising, it's not selfish, it's not self-centred, it's basic rules of safekeeping of oneself. From there follows safety for others. Miss out on the first step, you cannot provide safety for another person. So, clearly there are some rules for scuba diving, and if you put the tank on the top of your head and you dress as the person in the cartoon, it's fairly obvious that they're not familiar with safety procedures in diving. Similarly, if you were to put the mask at the back of your head, it's useless. I'm saying self-evident things because we have to question basic assumptions. What are we going to talk about safety during a pandemic? What is it that we want to be safe from? We want to be safe in the place where we work. For children, their workplace is school. For parents, if they're fortunate enough to still be working, it's either in the home under new circumstances or in their work setting where they still may be attending. Although in isolation and shutdown, it was ruptured. There was no preparation for it. It's not a criticism, it's a description. It happened suddenly. That's called a rupture. Ruptures have consequences. For us as clinicians, here is the list of words that we throw around where self-care was not possible. We can have burnout, vicarious trauma, moral injury, compassion fatigue, the well-known expression of the wounded healer. In the last 2 years, I've actually applied to myself as the ruptured carer. My situation is caring for my 94-year-old mum, who was in and out of hospital for 4 times 2 years ago, and then another 4 times last year. So the ruptures that I experienced as a carer made me transform from the wounded healer to the ruptured therapist. Going deeper, one of the primary lessons I've learned is an experience that technically the rupture is called a dissociation. This has got very serious consequences in our bodies, and as Ben said with his child, you get tummy aches for good reason. The tummy muscles contract so strongly through the autonomic nervous system that you actually get cramps. It used to be called abdominal migraines. You can get every symptom in the body affected in the similar way, just by stress rupture. I'll mention the references later, which are the pictures referred to there. For those who are technically minded and clinicians, what I'm talking about is the polyvagal system, Stephen Porges' discovery over the last 20 years, that relational trauma and relational safety is mediated, it's regulated. It's not a mysterious thing, it is scientifically known through the autonomic nervous system called the polyvagal system. The effects of dissociation are known by the acronym BASK. Behaviour gets disrupted, affect gets unregulated. You go off the roof, manic, hypomanic, or withdrawn and secluded, isolated. The sensations you can get, as Ben mentioned, chronic pain, alterations, paresthesias, the whole system of sensory modalities with spinning in the ears, dizziness, fainting, loss of balance. They're the sensations. The knowledge, two conditions clinically very familiar to most of us, depersonalisation and derealisation. Two states where the knowledge about ourselves is fundamentally altered, that we don't even know who we are in the middle of a dissociated state. So naturally, we want to repair the rupture. And so there are techniques to do this. There are tools for clinicians. The basic principle is do not talk too much. I would never try to do repair like I'm doing in this presentation by talking. I would use gestures, going, meaning I wouldn't say I don't know, I'd go signalling with gesture, facial expression and hands that I haven't got a clue, I'm clueless, but I don't say it. That's the point of non-verbal repair cycles. Now the 5 steps, the last 2 slides, and then I promise to stop. There are 5 steps to reach for safety after the dangerous, panicky, frightening, awful abyss of rupture. First, to become aware, which is what we're doing here, that it is a non-verbal state. Babies, by definition, do not have much vocabulary. They don't have a vocabulary, they have body language. You talk to babies with gestures and facial expressions and tone and prosody of your voice, not a monotone, big, long lecture. Secondly, we can reach stages that are barely bearable and we can go back and cope. But if we keep on going barely bearable, we reach a point of rupture and no return. That's when we need our buddy breathing to help us return. This can happen in the relationship, in the GP practice, in the hospital outpatients, in the group setting, or it can happen between sessions. It's not only in one place, this happens anywhere in our life cycle. The last 2, in between clinical spaces, is where we get recovery by engaging afterwards with a buddy. So again, the metaphor of diving, you catch your breath over a cup of coffee with a buddy. This could be your partner, this could be your supervisor, and in the cultural setting, and I understand that's the focus of tonight's presentation, community and cultural settings. Here are some of the buddy systems you can find availability in. Peer group supervision, individual supervision, case conferences, cycles of self-awareness and reflection by yourself through reading while you're listening to stereo or headphones. You can have personal therapy, you can have care infant developmental research you can be involved in, which sensitizes you to the need for reparative moments of rupture. And so the 2 references you notice have got no words. They're the covers of 2 books. And these are my mainstay of clinical work with families, with children, where the rupture between mother and child, father and child, between child and child siblings. First, you can't hide an elephant. It's a metaphor for the mentally ill parent. COPME is an abbreviation for children of parents with mental illness. There's a vast literature on COPME experiences and the elephant in the room if it's not acknowledged. Secondly, the colours of me. I just have to say this is not about gender. This is not the rainbow coloured issues. This is the colour of me, the first book about dissociation. Dissociation can be mild, moderate, or severe. And so it's a bit of a riddle which a child has, but it's up to the clinician not only to know the rupture of the child, but the rupture in ourselves, because we become the buddy for the ruptured child. If we can't be there to buddy breathe with the child is at risk because of us. That is called iatrogenesis. That is called doctor-created disorder or disease. So that's why I say it's a bit of a disruptive presentation, that I put ourselves in the formula. If we don't know what's going on, we can't do the buddy breathing. We are the cause of the distress, iatrogenesis. Not a nice thing to attend to, but ethically and morally, it's an essential for us as professionals to know about this. So finally, I just mentioned that I owe thanks to my mum, who explained to me the concept of vicarious trauma. Vicarious trauma is where you're not directly involved, but through a relationship with someone with trauma, it comes over to you. I tried to explain this to my mother, and because we talk in Hungarian, that's my mother tongue, I didn't have the words in Hungarian, so I was talking around it saying, you know, if a mother's happy, the baby's happy. Mother's sad, the baby's sad. Mother's traumatised, the baby's traumatised, sort of, but I didn't want to get her guilty about what she might have done. And she's looking at me and said, oh, so it's like passive smoking, is it? And I said, wow, yeah. So she said, well, why do you have to give a talk about it? Just say vicarious trauma is like passive smoking. And that's in fact that cartoon there. So thanks to my mum, passive smoking, if you want to take a take-home message, passive smoking is the equivalent of vicarious trauma. And I thank you for listening and for making the effort to come out and attend, as Ben's wife may not have, to a live in-person exchange as well as everyone online. I hope and look forward to the presentations to learn a lot from the next speakers. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, George. In my wife's defence, she's got 3 kids at home. So. I would now like to introduce Dr. Isaac Lim to speak for us. He's an infant and child psychiatrist who works in the perinatal and infant mental health team at Monash Health. His main clinical interests are in supporting families affected by parent-child relationship difficulties and intergenerational trauma. His main academic interests are translational research in perinatal and infant mental health and the ethics of mental health care. Just before Isaac comes up, if any thoughts come to you and you want to discuss it further, please, for those that are in person, we'll have a microphone coming around to ask questions, and for those online, please put your questions in the Slido, and that'll come to me, and then I can bring it up with the panel. Okay, thanks, Isaac.
Thanks very much, Ben, and thank you, George. And gee, you're a tough act to follow, George. George has been a really important figure in Australian psychiatry, in particular in child and adolescent psychiatry, my own home subspecialty, but also in the discourse around trauma in particular. So thank you very much, George, and it's a delight to be in the same forum as yourself. I should say that I'm not a senior lecturer. I'm a baby lecturer. I'm a junior lecturer, just a plain old lecturer, and I don't want to oversell myself. So I work in a perinatal and infant mental health team, which is a conception to 5 mental health team. And we work with both parents and very young children. And it may be a bit of an unusual concept to many people out there who perhaps haven't heard about infant mental health as a concept. And part of today's talk is going to be about clarifying that concept, so that you don't, think that I'm too unusual for one, but for two, hopefully I can persuade you of the importance of early life experience, because there is an enormous literature growing by the week about how important relationships in particular are in the first, especially first 1,000 days of life, but probably before life even begins in the prenatal period as well. And so that's why I work in a team that is from conception to 5, because there are continuities that exist through development right from conception, first, second, third trimester, infancy, toddlerhood, and preschool age. I guess I'd also need to thank right at the outset Dr. Alex de Young, who is a psychologist at the University of Queensland, who has been leading some extraordinary work over the last couple of years around the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on young children and their families. And I'm going to be presenting some of the research from her lab tonight. I'm not an investigator on that project, but I collaborate with Alex on another sort of related project, but that is too early on in its development to be able to share much about that tonight. So I'm going to stick to some of her other achievements and celebrating those. And I also would join in Jenny in acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting, the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. This is a little bit of an outline. I'll start with infant and early childhood mental health as an idea, then I'll move to the COVID-19 unmasked study, which is the Queensland-based study that I mentioned before. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the risk and protective factors for young children in the pandemic that have emerged from the research, not just from Alex's group, but internationally as well. And then finally, I'll end on a couple of resources for families out there. I want to start with the take-home messages, which somebody once told me was a wise thing to do, because you may not still be listening to me after the first 5 minutes. So first, if you take nothing else away, please don't forget about babies and young children and their experience. Young children have minds. They don't think or experience things in the same way that you or I do as adults, but they definitely have minds. And we know this intuitively because we're talking with babies, we're communicating with babies. We know that babies are learning from us all of the time and from the environment around them, and they're doing that with their mind. And where there is mind, there is mental activity. Where there is mental activity, there is mental health, and there is also mental ill health, which is rare in this age group because babies and young children have tremendous resilience as well. But it's really important not to forget that some young children really do struggle and deserve support. I guess one principle from the infant mental health literature is that what causes stress for the family causes stress for the infant. And this is following on from George's point, which is very well made, about the importance of putting your own oxygen mask on before you put it on anyone who's sitting next to you, even if it's your child. Because if you're not doing okay as a parent, then it does put the child at risk. Something that can protect children from the trauma and stress that may exist in the environment is a really positive, robust parent-child relationship. That's why my work as an infant and child psychiatrist really focuses on the relationship between parents and their children, not on the child individually, not on the parent individually, but thinking about them as a unit together, because that relationship is what scaffolds the development of the child. There are a lot of good things that families can do to help improve resilience and well-being in their families and in the lives of their children. And so, there is a good news story there, because there is so much change happening in the developing brain that it's very susceptible to environmental influences, and parents create the environment that children live in. So in as much as things that stress the parents can indirectly adversely affect the child, parents can do a lot to move in the other direction and support healthy development and resilience. And finally, if you do want some more information about the mental health and well-being of your child, then please do get in touch with a GP, mental health professional, or local children's health service. So I'm realising that I've done that poor time management thing. So I'm going to break things up a little bit with a short video that probably says everything that I want to say about infant and early childhood mental health, but uses pictures in a way that I'm not able to do just by speaking.
It's always okay to seek help in stressful times. If you need support, please see the resources at the end of this video. As adults, sometimes we don't realise how much stressful events can affect babies and young children. Separation from a parent or usual caregiver, injury or illness, natural disasters, and exposure to violence, whether in real life or on a screen, can all leave children feeling frightened, worried, sad, or angry. When difficult events like this happen, things can change for the whole family. While adults may be stressing about medical treatment, insurance, the cleanup, the bills, babies and young children may be upset by other things. Losing a favourite toy, worrying about their parents. These feelings are all completely normal. It's important that parents take time to care for themselves first, so they can then provide the best support for their children and help them work out how to respond. While children may be too young to fully understand the facts about what happened or what the future may hold, they can still be affected in many ways. Even siblings may respond to events differently. Some may have trouble getting to sleep, while others have nightmares. They may start to eat a lot more than before, or a lot less. Many children become more clingy following a disruption in their lives. Others may have tantrums or get upset by reminders of what happened. After a stressful event, it's important to help children feel that the world is safe and predictable again. Most babies and young children recover quickly with support from their parents and other caregivers. Try to re-establish family routines as soon as possible. Soothing activities can help. Try gentle rocking or swinging. Listening to music, or doing relaxation together. Reading a book about the stressful event can help a child structure and make sense of what they've experienced. Remember, young children often process their emotions through drawing, talking, or play, so it's important to be there for them. Show your child you're tuned in to how you and they are feeling, and that you'll always listen and care. Sometimes, a child may need more support to recover from a difficult time. If their behaviour continues to be unusual, interferes with daily activities like going to childcare, and starts to affect their relationships with you or with others, it may be time to get more help. There's lots of support available to help you, your child, and your family get back on track after a stressful event. Remember, it's always okay to get help and support for you and your little ones. Talk with your doctor, child health nurse, or another healthcare professional, or check out these online resources.
A video from the Centre for Perinatal and Infant Mental Health in Queensland, and they have a huge repertoire of resources that I think are really helpful. Before the COVID-19 pandemic, their focus was on the impact of trauma in early life. And thank goodness that was their area of expertise, because never has it been more relevant at a broad kind of public health community level. So when we speak about infant and early childhood mental health, we're not necessarily talking about mental illness or mental disorder. Very often we're talking about capacities that you would expect to see in ordinary development, and the trajectories for those social and emotional capacities. What capacities am I talking about? The capacity to develop relationships with others, to experience and manage emotions, to explore and learn from your environment, to persist when things are difficult, to adapt to changes in the environment. These are things that are a part of healthy development, but in situations of stress, trauma, rupture, these trajectories of development can get disrupted, and you either can have deficits in these capacities, or you can have, I guess, abnormal behaviours and processes that emerge. But by and large, infant and early childhood mental health is all about supporting healthy development, is the takeaway message here. Why is it important? Well, the hardwiring, the hardware for learning is laid down in these early years. And in fact, brain architecture is really determinatively influenced in this critical window of development that happens from conception to 5. And, you know, the brain always has the capacity to change later on, but never is there so much change in the brain happening as there is in those early years, which makes it particularly important. Stress also has an impact on body and physical health. So you probably are aware of the concept of stress hormones. So stress hormones can adversely impact physical health systems, the cardiovascular system, for example. And what has been demonstrated is that what's known as toxic stress, which is an unacceptably extraordinary high level of stress that is not buffered by protective factors like a strong parent-child relationship, can increase the likelihood of adverse physical health outcomes like 30, 40, 50 years down the track, heart disease, stroke, cancers even. And of course, finally, behaviour and relationships. The first relationships that a child has with their parents create the template for all future human relationships. Relationships are such a fundamental part of who we are as human beings living in communities, I hope that that's persuasive to you, that infant mental health is important. I think I've made this point about the spectrum of mental health to mental ill health. So let's press on to this study, the COVID Unmasked study. So here's another short video.
This is Birdie. Birdie is a happy bird who likes to sing. She lives in a nest in a tall tree near a forest. Birdie feels cosy and safe in her nest. Birdie likes to catch worms and talk with her friend Mr. Frog. Mr. Frog lives in a pond with green lily pads. One day, Mr. Frog felt yucky. His nose was runny. He had a cough. His head felt hot. I think I'm sick, croaked Mr. Frog. Mr. Frog had to lie down. Lots of their friends were sick too and had to stay at home in bed. Birdie felt sad and lonely because her friends couldn't play games with her. She also felt worried. What if Mr. Frog didn't get better? What if everyone stayed sick forever? Dr. Grace came along. She said, "Birdie, I know you feel sad and worried, but we will help Mr. Frog and everyone else feel better." Dr. Grace gave Mr. Frog a mask to wear. Everyone had to wash their hands. "Birdie," said Dr. Grace, "the thing making everyone sick is called a virus. We need to check for the virus inside your nose to see if you might get sick too." The little stick felt strange inside Birdie's nose, but it wasn't there long. It was hard for Birdie and Mr. Frog, having to stay home. They couldn't go out and do the things they usually did, but they found ways to have fun together. Birdie didn't get sick, and soon Mr. Frog felt better, and so did everyone else. Birdie was so happy to go out and explore and play with her friends again.
Land, and is a good example, I think, of the power of story and narrative that's presented in a child-appropriate way that is playful and accessible, that may help young children process and have something to hold on to around what has happened to them over the last few years. There's a whole series of Birdie stories. Originally, they were developing stories for Birdie in natural disaster situations, because in Queensland at the time that was, extremely a pressing need for young children, and they've adapted it, as you can see, for COVID. This is the team behind the COVID-19 Unmasked study, and the aim here was to try and understand what the experience of the pandemic was for families with very young children, and as much as possible, as is possible in a survey, try and understand about the mental health outcomes for young children aged between 1 and 5 and their caregivers over a 12-month period. And the hope was that we might be able to understand over those 12 months the trajectories, that is the risk and protective factors that shape whether children recover well at the end of it, or perhaps have challenges remaining at the end. This is some technical language about the kind of study that it was. It was a prospective longitudinal study. They collected data in about May of 2020, then 3 months after that, 3 months after that, and 3 months after that. And I don't have all of the data from that time period, but I do have from baseline 3 months and 6 months. The 6-month data hasn't been published, but the first 2 time points have been published. So this is a little bit about the demographic of the families involved in the study. Disproportionately, there were kind of wealthier, highly educated families, many of whom had parents who were healthcare workers, and that's probably a result of how the survey was distributed and who was sharing the survey, and who was interested in participating in this kind of research. and the mean age of children in the study was 3.75, so roughly 3.5 to 4 years of age. About 46% of the families came from Queensland. This was a Queensland-based study, but there was pretty good representation as well from New South Wales and from Victoria as well. We did a little bit to try and help with that. However, over 77% of families were from inner city areas, so this data set doesn't capture very well the experience of regional and remote communities, which is an identified need for further work. So what did this study find? Well, young children seem to be most affected by not seeing their friends and family, which probably doesn't come as much as of a surprise to those of you with young children, but also important, and don't pay too much attention to these numbers. It's kind of more the categories that I want to speak to. Changes in routine, missing important events. These are very, significant losses, ruptures in the life of a child. And of course, they are, in a sense, indirect effects of COVID. So in this cohort, almost no children actually contracted COVID, but they were still being impacted by the pandemic through these other pathways. And parents, of course, had their own difficulties. Many felt isolated, lonely, trapped. There were relationship problems with their children. There were relationship problems with their partners. And there was an increase in the incidence of family violence, sadly. And for families as a whole, difficulties getting essentials, financial hardship. These were really challenging kind of times for families. And one of the most commonly reported difficulties for parents that was reported was trying to juggle working from home arrangements and schooling from home arrangements, which I'm sure many of you know from firsthand experience is a superhuman undertaking. The good news is that 80% of the children in the survey had good mental health at the point of the survey. This was pretty early in the pandemic, but 1 in 5 were experiencing mild to moderate emotional and behavioural difficulties, and a small proportion, roughly 5 to 10%, were showing more severe symptoms that might have required some specialised support. And these are issues like, tantruming beyond what is developmentally appropriate, fears, worries, clinginess, low mood, and sleeping difficulties. These were the more common kinds of symptoms that were seen. And this graph is a little bit complicated, but basically, so these are the 3 time points. In May of 2020, roughly 3 months after that, and another 3 months after that. What you can see is that for many of the symptoms that were being measured in children, there was pretty good bounce back. Green is those children who scored within normal limits, so there were no concerns about the symptoms. And the orange is mild to moderate difficulties, the red is severe difficulties. So anger kind of bounced back, depression bounced back, sleep disturbance bounced right back. What was a bit concerning was the increase in anxiety that continued. And of course, that kind of makes sense if you think about how much our conversations in families, in homes, at school, on the news, the conversation was all about COVID. And there is a problem about exposing young children to bad news stories all the time. And that seems to increase stress and cause escalating anxiety over time. This separates out those children who experienced a second lockdown, shown here in green, and those who didn't experience a second lockdown are in the dark purple. And so what you can see is that for those children who experienced a second lockdown, they did end up having higher scores on measures of depressed mood, sleep disturbance, anxiety, anger and irritability. So one interpretation of this data is that lockdown itself was associated with worse mental health outcomes for these young children. And of course, this is some data on parents. And what we can see is that the same goes for parents as went for children. Those who were in more lockdown found it more challenging. This may be stating the obvious, but I guess it's helpful to really subject our intuition to empirical testing in the form of this kind of research. However, there were some positive experiences and silver linings that came out of lockdown and the pandemic. More quality family time. This is what was reported by these families. Increased closeness among family members, gratefulness and appreciation for what they do have, and knowing that they can cope even in extraordinarily difficult times. So I'm aware of the time, and I will wrap up in a few more minutes. So what can we take away from this research? Well, protective for children in circumstances such as these are maintaining routine and restoring routine where that is possible. This helps with a child's regulation of their body and mind, a predictable and consistent cycle through the day. Warm and responsive caregiving, regularly doing things outside of the home where that's possible. That could be, going for a walk down at the park. As as we know in Melbourne, we only had an hour a day to do these things, and it was difficult. And where there is less confusion about COVID, children tend to do better. Children tend to do worse when they get too much exposure to information about COVID-19, where their parents are worried, where their parents have mental health difficulties, where the child is worried about the threat that COVID may pose to their own health, but probably more importantly, to the health of their parents and loved ones, including grandparents, teachers, avoidant or overprotective parenting. So that's the opposite of too much information, is pretending like nothing is happening when so obviously something is happening and something has changed. Trying to deny that reality to children is crazy making. And of course, parent-child relationship difficulties. So these, I'm going to skip through these. These are some resources from another really excellent group out of San Francisco, Pipo Productions, which is led by Chandra Ghosh-Ippen, who is a psychotherapist at the University of California, San Francisco. And she has authored a number of children's books featuring little mouse characters. And I would highly recommend this resource to you. Other resources that I would recommend, there are some great illustrated storybooks, more about Birdie, who we saw before. There's this book that's really about relaxation and meditation mindfulness practices, which you can do with very young children. And you know what? They absolutely love it. Fun activities, some other resources that have come out of this same group, including activities that you can see. This is an activity about emotional identification. This is an activity to try and make sense of why everyone's wearing all of these strange costumes. They've also developed a tip sheet for supporting children and for supporting parents. So I would advise you to take a look at that website. And this is the book written by Chandra Ghosh Ippen that's also available as a video on YouTube. It takes about 20 minutes, so it is a longer kind of book than Birdie and the Virus, but it's a really lovely elaboration of what the experience might be like for a child. So these are my take-home messages, and I just want to end on something a little bit fun, which is Birdie and Mr. Frog with a message about washing your hands.
Birdie says, wash your hands, cover coughs and sneezes, keep your hands away from your face so you won't catch diseases. Wash your hands, cover coughs and sneezes, stay at home if you are sick so you won't spread diseases.
Thanks very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Isaac, for that really enlightening and fun presentation, and it's given me a lot to think about. And we'll talk more about it in the panel discussion. Now I'd like to welcome up Jade McLoney, who's Jade's a social worker with 16 years of experience working in mental health across various contexts, including humanitarian, NGO, and public mental health. Jade's career has been motivated by a strong sense of compassion for people experiencing severe mental disorders, trauma, and disadvantage. She currently works in emergency mental health. Thanks, Jade.
Hi. I've enjoyed the other speakers so much. I hope I haven't forgotten the points I'd like to make. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is drawn very much on my humanitarian work. About 10 years ago, I spent 2 years on the Thai-Burma border, and I was working in a clinic just outside one of the refugee camps, and I use the word clinic very loosely. It was a concrete bamboo structure, and there was a bunch of Burmese refugees who were volunteers, and they were just, they had no experience in looking after people with mental health issues, but they just had a strong desire to do so, and a tiny stipend for their efforts. So I draw a little bit on that. So yeah, defining the pandemic as disaster. So we talk about the pandemic as being, you know, an experience that we've never had before. But I do believe it's a disaster similar to other disasters. There's a lot of similarities, and I think in responding to the mental health needs that have been created by the pandemic, I think it's important to draw on disaster, what we've learned from responding to disaster. So the World Health Authority defined disaster as an occurrence disrupting the normal conditions of existence and causing a level of suffering that exceeds the capacity of adjustment of the affected community. As you can hear, there's a lot of similarities to the definitions of trauma as well. And trauma can be defined as the way you see yourself, the way you see the world, and the way you see other people. Your belief system has been kind of totally altered, and that's what a trauma. And the pandemic is it's a mass trauma event, a collective trauma. And it's, for most of us, it's the first time we've ever experienced anything like this, and since the Second World War. So similarly to earthquakes, bushfires, floods, disaster and the pandemic create a sense of loss of control. There's a loss of resources, sense of isolation. There's adjustment to the new life. You feel unsafe. There's sickness and death. Mental health issues dramatically rise. People with previous disorders are very vulnerable. And then some people develop mental health issues that never would have if there hadn't have been a pandemic. Systems are strained, and of course, family violence increases. So there's, really broadly speaking, there's 3 types of impacts. Tier 1 is people who do obviously have a very difficult experience during lockdown and the pandemic. And it's not to minimise what they've gone through, but they just have the internal resources and the external resources in order to cope and to just kind of move on. And they spontaneously recover without too much input. And, you know, they get out of lockdown and they go on a barbecue and meet up with all their friends and have beach days and go on a holiday. And they've just got the ability to sort of process what's happened. Tier 2 people where the symptoms are persisting. They don't have a significant mental health issue. They don't have post-traumatic stress disorder, but they might have post-trauma stress syndrome or traumatic stress. And adjustment might be quite tricky. They might not be thriving. And they might require some skills and some resources in order to recover. And I think we all kind of, can see that there's difficulty adjusting back to school. People are having difficulty adjusting back in the office. Some people are still feeling overwhelming sense of stress when someone coughs, or any reminders of the pandemic might create some very difficult sensations and feelings in the body. And then there's tier 3. These people have been significantly impacted, and they will require treatment by mental health professionals. So after a disaster or during a disaster, the mental health system is completely overwhelmed. And the individual model of treatment during disaster, it doesn't have the scope required for a pandemic. The widespread mental health impacts just overwhelm the mental health system, and it's not practicable anymore to utilise our usual clinical systems in order to respond to the overwhelming need. So when I was on the Thai-Burma border, I was utterly overwhelmed about how I was going to respond with this lovely group of volunteers and all these incredibly unwell people. There was no psychologist, no psychiatrist. We had no Zoom. I mean, it was just, I had to really laterally think with my colleagues about, who spoke very limited English, and I didn't speak any Burmese, about how we were going to respond to this stuff. And I ended up downloading a book called Collective Trauma, Collective Healing, by a psychologist and expert in mental health disaster response. And it really inspired me and helped me think creatively. And it required a real paradigm shift in thinking about psychosocial responses and utilising the strengths and the resources that were already within the people that we were working with. And his name's Jack Saul, and he spoke about how he actually lives in New York, and he was a disaster expert, and he was in New York when the Twin Towers, when the terrorist attack 9/11 happened. And he noted straight after that all the funding was going to trauma counselling. And it was a lot of the funding for the mental health difficulties post the attack was going to one-on-one therapy, and he knew this just wasn't going to be able to have the breadth that was needed. So he got some funding too, him and his team, and they held forums, maybe not dissimilar to this one. They held forums and they asked the community, what does your mental health require post 9/11? And they said, and one of the things they asked for was scientific experts to talk to them about air quality and how to protect themselves from the dust. That was one of their main stresses, that their children were breathing in this toxic dust, and how to protect their children and their families. And another concern, obviously, is often children. And children were drawing, people jumping out of windows, and people were concerned that the children were disturbed. So they ran art classes after school, 30 children, an art therapist, a psychologist, and helped children make meaning out of what had happened to them through art and through play, helps them process. Conceptualizing mental health and well-being of each individual, I think, it needs to be the responsibility of the community at whole. We can't just rely on mental health professionals. I think fostering collective context for healing and meaning is incredibly important. Utilising public spaces, public commemoration, rituals of mourning. I was thinking about a Remembrance Day where we could all have a public holiday. Trauma processing doesn't just have to happen through therapy. It can happen by watching a film, theatre, artists, musicians. And I think mental health professionals need to think about doing group work and moving a little bit away from the one-on-one model, and considering, if you're not yet skilled in group work, but you are a mental health professional, consider getting training and delivering services to groups so that we can reach more people. And I think skill-based workshops are important as well, providing people with the tools to manage anxiety and manage depression. And forums just like this. So yeah, the take-home message for me, I guess, to all you guys is that what can you bring? What resources and skills do you have to respond to the mental health needs and the well-being of our community? Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Jade. So now we're going to have our panel discussion. So if anyone has any questions from the audience, I've got a microphone over here that you can ask questions. And yeah, if anyone online has anything they'd like to bring up for us to talk about, please do that. I think we've got a question from the audience over here.
Hi, my name is Radhika, and I'm a student from RMIT. I'm studying social work, so I had a question for Jade. What inspired you to work in mental health or study mental health? And for a student who's studying social work, what would you advise, or what would you say? And how can we specialize in mental health? Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I was inspired to work in mental health because I'm incredibly curious about people. People really fascinate me, and yeah, I just want to know what they're thinking and feeling and why. Yeah, it's just a real curiosity about people and a care. And I think social workers have got something quite unique to bring to the mental health field. They've got quite lefty politics, you know. They tend to be feminist humanitarians. They tend to have a bit of a political opinion, which is quite different, I think, when you do other types of training, and that can be a really great discussion in a clinical review. And yeah, you do kind of need extra training, I think, post the degree. So yeah, it's more study, unfortunately.
Just something that you brought up, Isaac, I thought about exposing people to too much. And if parents aren't doing well, that all bets are off, essentially. I know I wrote a lot of letters for patients to allow them to either give or receive care during the lockdown, in case they were stopped by police and asked what they were doing. And I was interested in what sort of things you did in the infant mental health team to balance the needs of, I guess we're balancing the needs of the greater population, which is, not spreading the virus and exposing people that are at risk to the virus, versus what I would imagine is a life and death situation for an infant and their family, with where either the parent or the infant has severe signs of mental illness, and versus, it's as life and death as someone who has an elevated risk if they contract COVID. So it sort of becomes a bit of an ethical issue as well. And I know that that's one of your interests, ethics, and George as well. So I'd be interested to hear what you say about that.
It's a great question, Ben. And I guess the answer is that we were juggling those various and sometimes competing needs. So our inpatient parent and infant unit, which some people might know as like mother and baby unit, which is a psychiatric inpatient ward for parents and their young children. That kept open the entirety of the pandemic, but was really reserved for those parent-infant dyads or pairs who were experiencing a very high level of distress. And we're talking kind of the extreme end of people feeling like they want to die, or they want to kill their child. So it's sort of quite on the very extreme end of things. And of course, those acute services have to continue even when there is something of a risk of people bringing the virus into the hospital. And of course, there were really robust and quite strict screening procedures to try and minimise that likelihood. People even had to have COVID tests before they came into the unit, and would sometimes be waiting in emergency departments for their test result to come back, so that then they could be safely brought to a unit, which is a risky place to be, because it's a kind of closed system, as it were. So if one person brings it into the ward, then you can have an outbreak in a ward, and wards, Ward A might share a ventilation system with Ward B, so it kind of it was tricky. For community-based work, we moved almost entirely to telehealth appointments. which was generally well accepted by our patients. Some people struggled quite a bit in the transition to telehealth because it is a different sort of way to be receiving help if you're used to coming in and talking with a therapist face to face. Some people, for various reasons, didn't want to be on a camera. Some people don't have great internet or didn't want to use up all of their data for a 1-hour appointment with a therapist when actually they need that data for kind of more fundamental basic needs. There were a small number of families who we saw face to face, usually when there was a high level of risk involved, sort of that in-between space, where the family wasn't quite distressed enough to need an inpatient ward, but where we really wanted to connect with them face to face. And I must say, toddlers and preschoolers are really hard to engage over telehealth for extended periods of time. So we did find sometimes as well that those more mobile children, really to do the work practically, it had to be face to face. Otherwise, we'd sort of be following people down corridors in their homes, and it was really not that workable. So yeah, we were juggling a lot of those things, trying to minimize the risk of causing the spread of infection, but also trying as much as we could to meet the mental health needs of the families that we were working with and who kept being referred to us, because those were real needs as well, that had their own risks.
I think Jade mentioned that we should think of new ways to be able to meet the needs of the community mental health wise with things like group work and being innovative. And that sort of reminds me about, I guess the point of reflecting is not just to debrief, but to plan for what we'll do. Because hopefully that the pandemic is the worst of it's over, but there could be new variants, and planning for how we're going to do things again if there does have to be measures to reduce the spread of the virus. And I'm just thinking, is there going to be initiative taken in training up people to do this group work, but also now that we have research like COVID-19 Unmasked and other research going on that sort of shines a light on this shadow pandemic that is talked about, but I don't think there's been that much research, that makes it into the sort of general public's mind. And now it's not just numbers of cases and deaths that we have to consider. We've always, as professionals, known that there should have been a balance, but now we have data that says that while there's increase in family violence, there's increase in lots of negative health outcomes, and how are we going to, and this is another ethical question, balance those needs with the spread of the virus going forward. Does anyone want to discuss that further?
I think one relevant experience that I've learned from was in early 2020 from the experiences in Europe. And it came from the Italian experiences in intensive care units. That gave rise to a new phenomenon that then became much more talked about, called moral injury. And this roughly amounted to the difficulty that the intensive care staff had in decision-making about a scarce resource called a ventilator, meeting a demand that was exceeding the supply. Now, this was not just an economic supply-demand equation, but a life and death one, given that those patients who needed respirators and were in a certain age group and certain risk factor were not given that option because younger or healthier patients had a higher chance of recovery. Now, that's a decision making for which mental health staff were not trained. We're usually trained to save lives. Some people say excessively trained to save without due respect for the dignity of death. That's another debate. But the point here is when so-called experts aren't trained for the decisions that they have to make clinically, they, like any other human being, get stressed. And here the stress was a moral decision, not a medical decision, because the medical decision informed a life and death outcome. So you either extubated, that is, took out a tube from someone who's being kept alive, and therefore the consequence is death, or you decided not to intubate, not to put the tube in the first place. Consequence is a very high risk of death according to the selective criteria. So I think one of the lessons that I learned very early on is not to dissociate or disconnect from that ignorance, lack of skills, and lack of training that I had. Now, to translate it into the mental health field, it's pretty obvious, I think, that there is a much greater demand, even for the life-threatening, let alone the less extreme but clearly demanding attention population, than the services either in the public health system, inpatient or outpatient, or the community services, public or private, could ever meet. So this is, I think, something about how I understand dissociation can be overcome. It's a necessary process, so don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-dissociation. It's how we survive crises, how we actually get into survival mode and get through that phase. But then to stay dissociated is a negative. So that's one of the lessons. Now we've got a little bit of a breathing space as a community. How do we use this breathing space not to remain dissociated? Clearly we need the good times, and I just love the lightheartedness with which the communication is possible, meeting children where they're at. And I was delighted that Birdie got cured and got a playmate, Froggy Black, you know, and the turtle and everyone. It's a bit of a happy ever after Hollywood ending. So I hope they make one where not everything is so Hollywoodish, get a bit of French drama and European sort of noir experiences, and get the balance into the child's life, because to fantasize and create illusions and reality is necessary, but it's more complicated than just the happy ending. So the question there again is morality and ethics. Who else would advise but the so-called ethical decision makers? And so one of the practical questions I have, does the community, to follow Jade, your experience in what is clearly beyond tolerable, but you went in there and you tried to offer and mobilize your creativity, and you're inspiring us. Would you suggest, so it's a question, that an ethicist be appointed to a community team on guiding the community? Now we're at the middle-ish end of March 2022. If there is another wave of variation or COVID winter or influenza winter, are we going to be ethically prepared how to distribute the scarce resource? Because I don't know how to make those decisions. So would you have liked an ethicist there, or would you like to have an intensive care person there?
Another ventilator. I guess with Yeah, with mental health, I think it has been a little bit like that. We've only been able to offer services to a few, and we've said no to people, and they've suffered greatly. So it has been, I think that is what's been happening. So we do need to think about a wider reach, a much wider reach, and think about how we can, what that intervention might look like.
Would you go so far as to say that suffering is a loss of safety for you as a professional?
Yes, I would say that was one of the most stressful aspects of working in mental health during the pandemic was not being able to provide services for the amount of need that was there. Yeah.
Jade, you worked in, and are still working in emergency departments, is it?
Yeah.
What sort of different or just more severe presentations did you see in the emergency department during the pandemic from a mental health point of view? And I imagine it was complicated because there were all the health and safety protocols as well about attending the hospital.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, a lot of people weren't supposed to come in if they had a cold or flu symptoms. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I noted a lot of things, and I think one of the things I noticed in the emergency department was people were presenting and young teenage girls. This is very anecdotal experience. But young teenage girls from very good schools, doing well academically, were presenting as suicidal and with overdoses. And that was, and you could see the family context was secure, and it was a warm environment for that family in normal circumstances. But the circumstances of lockdown and pressures to do well in school, and because they were academically sort of aspiring children, they did really suffer in the. I don't think they would have been presenting an emergency with suicidal ideation if there hadn't have been a lockdown. Yeah,
I had that with a lot of my patients that I sort of said they might not have ever gotten referred to me if there hadn't been the pandemic, because it probably would have stayed at a more manageable level.
Yeah.
I've got some questions from the audience online. With many people preferring a Zoom or online presence rather than going out to a face-to-face experience, is this contributing to people feeling flat or depressed?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
So with many people preferring a Zoom or online presence rather than going out to a face-to-face experience, is this contributing to people feeling flat or depressed? And I guess my initial thought is like, depends why they're choosing it. If they're choosing it because it's the only way that they can attend something that they want to attend, then maybe that's not contributing. But if they're doing it to avoid, because they're already feeling depressed and they want to avoid, and that further isolates them, then that could definitely contribute. But
that's a really interesting question from the audience. And I agree with what you say, Ben, about it really depending on the reasons, and many people are still really worried about contracting COVID because many people haven't had it yet, and it still is frightening. And so I think people can have legitimate reasons to not want to assemble in larger groups of people than absolutely necessary. I do think that being out and about and doing things, seeing people, I think, and this is anecdotal as well, but also borne out by some of the research that we've seen, this is good for our mental health, to connect with other people. Now, meeting face-to-face is not the only way to connect with people, of course. But for many of us, there is something lost in connecting through a screen, and there's something about inhabiting the same physical space that enriches the experience somehow. And I must say that I'm really grateful to be able to meet face to face today. When I was asked to do this, in fact, up until Monday, I thought it was going to be on Zoom, and I was just so surprised to know that it was going to be in person. But now that I'm here, I'm really glad that it's in person, and that I'm able to sort of connect with people in the room in a different way to, if I was a face on the screen, which is how, plenty of gatherings happen these days.
I've got a really interesting question here. My daughter gets anxious about what swimming teacher she will have each week, as there have been about 4 different ones this term due to COVID. What can I do to help? Who wants to have a go at that?
Dr. Mellors.
Well, I think that touches on perhaps the most fundamental question of what in a relationship creates safety. And one of the elements is reliability, sustainability, continuity, and dependency. Now, if any one of those are interrupted in an unprepared way, it's more likely to go to the spectrum of, on your graph, the unwellness, illness, the rupture. If it's going to occur in a prepared way, it'll be more on the spectrum of an ordinary separation or taking a break or a holiday in the relationship. So relationships are on a spectrum depending upon the mindset of the 2 or more people in the relationship. And I think, Isaac, as you mentioned, that babies also have a mental life and think. And that's the message I got very strongly from your presentation, that please remember that the babies who are separated, unprepared, are going to create a template, as you said, for life perhaps, about relationships suddenly rupturing, dissociated. Now, as you also said, from conception to 5 years is the template. It doesn't mean that's going to be for life. The neuroplasticity, the other experiences that we know through art, right brain activities, dancing, music, all the non-verbal things, can actually reconfigure the architecture. So it's not a lost cause after age 5. We're not doomed with the template. But it is a truth that it is very, very profoundly informing the rest of life. So the answer to the particular is, if you've already had 2 or 3 interruptions with the swimming teacher, have a serious talk about what this is about. Is that teacher so significant in your daughter's life? Yes, because teachers are central to the relationship of a growing person. Indeed, even for adults, that's why a teacher is so critical, a mentor. So I think the prepared mind buffers against the severity of the rupture. And that's what we do in therapy. We go back in the individual or in the group to relive, re-traumatize, if the truth be known, but with the intention of de-traumatizing, to repair, to bring the ruptures together so that the natural flow of life can then resume. There's nothing magical in what we do in trauma therapy. It is hard. Some people call it the tiger country of treatment, because you're actually getting all the, more for children, less tiger-oriented, the ghosts from the past. And that's why the references, like you also, I use children's books, The Elephant in the Room. Straight away, a child's curious, what elephant? You don't see the elephant? Are you crazy? No, I just think there is an elephant here. I can hear the swoosh. Really? Listen. And then you've got something magical happening called therapy. But it's with an intent to re-establish relationships. And then you say, an elephant never forgets. Didn't you know that? Oh, of course well, that's why the elephant's in the room, to help us remember. And then you're into the trajectory of the normal development that was interrupted by rupture and dissociation. So a swimming teacher is enough to trigger a major rupture, especially in a susceptible person who's had the template pre-existing. And that's the fertile ground for PTSD or complex PTSD, that the trigger is trivial, like the Vietnam veteran who hears a car backfire and suddenly jolts. Why? Because that trigger of the car backfiring triggers the rifles from Vietnam. Swimming teacher missing could trigger an early death in the family or separation. I'm not speaking now particularly, but generally. So a superficial event can be the trigger for the most serious rupture. And that's what we're there for, to do the scuba diving, the deep dive.
And I think especially with a swimming teacher who's there to help them with the safety of swimming, it's not really an okay situation. So I mean, depends how kind of brave you are in terms of advocating for your daughter, or you might ask someone to help you with this. I think you could talk to the manager of the swimming school and explain that your daughter's anxious and she needs the same teacher every week, and that's just what has to happen. And maybe if they won't do that, then you might need to think about moving to a place that can do it, or then you might have to weigh up whether. Swimming's obviously very important to learn, but this is not a innocuous situation either for the child, I don't think. I don't know.
Sorry, just to interrupt there.
Yeah.
In these times that we're experiencing, and all over the workforce, we have the situation that people aren't there each day. So with the child, is it possible to maybe build that resilience rather than thinking there's no continuity? I don't believe so at this point. There is some, but it's constantly being broken up. So how can we then make it more of an adventure? Or, hey, who are we going to have today? That's a possibility too, because I think searching for a swim school that has that at the moment, well, I'd be surprised. It'd be wonderful. However, that's what we're living in at the moment.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to weigh up all those things. In terms of the resilience, I think Isaac might have something to say about that, because that was a big part of your presentation.
Well, it is a reality that teachers are often in isolation because of contracting COVID or because of being in close contacts. There is a lot of unpredictability in the world that is a reality, and I guess. What I would say is that, adventure and, exploration is possible where there is some internalized safety. So even if the swimming teacher is changing, if there is some really predictable, consistent, warm caregiving within the family that may act as a buffer against the stress of, well, where's my teacher? My teacher should be here. Is my teacher okay? Are they ever going to come back? So yeah, it's sort of about this system, this balance of stressors and resilience factors. And one way to build resilience is that is in the caregiving relationship, in the family home, enjoying positive interactions with loved ones, trying to keep routine, regulatory activities, eating at the same time, having little rituals and sort of things that the family does together to build on those things that are consistent and are predictable. So yeah, I think it's a great point, because we do live in a world that has lots of unpredictability that seems kind of endemic now. Mm-hmm.
Even using that curiosity of a different teacher, the person who has taken the child to the swim can be saying, what did this teacher show you? Can you show me? Again, bringing it, drawing it back in rather than.
We've got a question from Claire.
Yeah. Oh, hi. Look, I really wanted to say thank you so much to everybody. I love the buddy thing and I love the birdie, but I have got a question that I really want for Jade to try to answer, if you can. If you had a bucket of money for the community, what would the steps be to work out a collective healing process for, say, the community in the western suburbs? What would be useful? I mean, GPs are overwhelmed, psychiatrists and psychologists are all full. We do need to think outside the box a little. And, you're a social worker with some, sorry to put it on you, but look, could you sort of smash out some ideas?
You're not on the spot.
Well, I think first of all would be to create a discussion with the community and ask them what they want, what they need. So anticipating that, I don't know. I guess if money was unlimited, well, I'd probably put on a massive music festival, along the river or something, I think it involves. It doesn't involve one-on-one. We need to think beyond that, and we need to think about people that aren't necessarily mental health professionals being skilled up and getting involved as well in responding to these needs. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, sort of. So you're saying ask the community first, skill up non-professionals.
Ask the community.
So we can all be mental health professionals. We can empower other people to work with mental health. Is that what you're saying, sort of empowering maybe youth workers and teachers? And not that the teachers aren't overwhelmed, so I don't want to overwhelm other people by giving them more work. But I think, like you're saying, involving artists and musicians, and maybe we don't need buckets of money to do some of these things as a community. But how do we ask people what they need? How do we do that? Have you got any ideas on that one?
Well, I think a forum just like this, asking people what they need. Now we can do things online, surveys, research. I think asking mental health workers as well what they think is required. I think some sort of community evaluation and input about rather than just assuming what they might need.
We've got another question from the audience.
Hi, sorry, I know we're running out of time. Sorry. I've just got a question on for kids in schools. So for children who come from broken families, what is the best way to engage with them? it can be like from a social work perspective or just holistically, like what's the best way to engage with children who come from broken families in schools when doing therapy or when engaging with them, especially because it's such a sensitive topic. And if they're hesitant to talk about it, you know, what would be the best way to engage with them? I guess that's my question.
Yours, I think it might be George. I think it might be George's question. I see preschoolers.
Look, I think that's a very profound question, and it's a question of the current crisis. And the current crisis has brought to light the need to adopt what is called for the last 20 years trauma-informed care. Now, trauma-informed care is a paradigm change that started about 20 or so years ago as a movement, which has got policies, principles, and propagated through North America, Europe, Australia. So it's not a novel creation, it's established. There's a lot of research data to back what trauma-informed care is. In essence, talk is not necessarily the best way to get at the essence of trauma. So forget, I agree, talk therapies as such. Not forget, please. I take that back. I will be deregistered from my college. So with caution, balance talk therapy with a whole range, a spectrum of available treatments. At the one-on-one is EMDR. In the hands of good trained professionals, and they can be trained at various levels, primary levels, more complex trauma therapist EMDR. Now that's a proven intervention specifically directed at trauma. So on the one hand, there is individual but non-talk therapy. There is some talk in it, but that's not the essence. The other extreme is the group approaches, which address the so-called right brain to right brain communication. Music therapists at the Royal Children's Hospital have been there for eons. Movement therapists, dance therapists out in the community. Art therapists are part of psychiatric hospital tradition for 50 plus years. Pottery and other handcrafts. Movement and dance therapies. These are all what I call the non-verbal therapies. And drawing and art and picture books and so on speak to the legitimacy of this right brain to right brain. And that's the communication that I would invest in if I had bucket loads of money, and start pilot studies. Start 4 groups, one offering painting and art, one offering music, one offering pottery, and one offering drama or ballet. Have a registered art therapist, drama therapist, music therapist, and so on, and advertise it in the community that it is for free for 5 sessions. Build into it a mini research. What are the people coming for? What are they presenting complaints, and what are they entering in the hope of? And an exit, or get a research designer who actually does a formal pilot study. At the end of 5 weeks, have some researcher for 5 weeks analyze the data, compare which intervention addressed which problem. So rate the outcomes according to best, middle, or hopefully not worse, but make sure that there's a medical ethical cover for the whole project. So you would have to have an ethics committee approval for the piloting of these 3 or 4 pilot studies. And that's how I would invest bucket loads of money, using the best outcome of the pilots to then a substantial study. But study as research as the base, not because it feels good. I mean, I've got nothing against feeling good. Yeah? But I mean, if you're investing taxpayers' money, you want to be accountable.
Thanks, George. Unfortunately, we have to finish up there. There's a few questions there that still weren't answered, but there's another 3 of these forums coming up. The next one's on the 5th of May, and it's on adolescent mental health. And we've got a few really excellent speakers there. We have Claire Cody, who is the consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist at the Village Clinic in Newport, which runs a really great service there. Unfortunately, they are very full up at the moment. We've got Jacinta Blisa, who's an excellent child and adolescent and parent therapist, who's a psychologist, and we have Deb Mountjoy representing Headspace, which is the a large national service that you've probably heard about. I'd like to thank all of our unbelievable speakers tonight. It's been such a pleasure to share this space with you, and I hope we can discuss a lot more in the future. There's going to be some resources on the webpage after this, and as Isaac mentioned in his talk, that you should definitely see your GP if any of this has brought up things that you need to talk more about, and there'll be some other resources on that page that you can access. And I'd also like to thank Westgate Health Co-op for giving me the opportunity to facilitate these community forums, and look forward to the next ones.
All right, I'd like to take the opportunity to once again, Ben, reinforce our thanks to George, Isaac and Jade for their presentations, and Ben, to you for your facilitation. 2 of our directors, Bev Kennedy and Dr. Claire Rosnack, would like to just make a presentation to each of our presenters. Ben, sorry, you've got to come back for the next one, so.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
All right. Thank you to you, our participants, both those of you online and also those of you that are with us in person. We'd really value your feedback as we continue to develop up the next 3 forums, and where once again we've got excellent presenters lined up, and it would be great to see you at either one or all of these forums. For those of you that are with us in person, please stay and join us in some light refreshments. So thank you.